David Sirlin is quite a controversial figure in the fighting game community. With the habit of talking his mind and voicing his opinions thoroughly, Sirlin and his blog had received a very divisive reputation. Some people calling him quite arrogant, self-righteous and outright offensive to his fanbase, others being supportive of Sirlin, speaking his mind and being vocal about things he is passionate about, and the last camp encouraging people to separate the art from the artist and take the games at face value with avoiding creators' other media altogether. Although it is undeniable that Sirlin is incredibly critical of many popular competitive games, outright calling the mechanics of mainstream games, such as collectible card games and MOBAs, fraudulent, disrespectful to players, requiring too much grinding, being anti-competitive, and etc. One of the most famous pieces of work that kicked off Sirlin's career is attributed to the remake of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix features the same roster of characters as Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and two single-player gameplay modes, Classic and HD Remix. Multiplayer gameplay modes include local multiplayer, player match, and ranked match, along with online tournaments. Other notable features included in the game are a hitbox display in training mode to show players where their moves affect their opponent. Another is the inclusion of quarter match mode, allowing players to spectate and instantly join online match lobbies, simulating an arcade environment. The reception of the game was incredibly positive. Despite the game only being out after 2009 in the European PlayStation Network, a year after its North American release, the game easily broke the sales figures. Some of Sirlin's initial fame can also be attributed to his balanced articles for Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix. After the overwhelming success and a few other projects, with most known online card game Congai, Sirlin decided to take the matter of game design and production into his own hands, starting his own company Sirlin Games. The company's initial projects mostly consisted of tabletop and puzzle games centered around Sirlin's fictional universe called Fantasy Strike. In January 2015, Sirlin created a podcast on his Patreon page discussing the possibility of creating a simple yet accessible fighting game. After an unsuccessful attempt of convincing Capcom to let Sirlin feature Street Fighter characters in his future game, in June 2015, Sirlin announced that he would begin creating a fighting game set in and featuring characters from his Fantasy Strike universe. The resulting Fantasy Strike fighting game was released in early access on Steam in September 2017. The game is advertised as follows: a fighting game designed to be easily accessible by new and non-fighting game players, an ability to play the game with basically any controller, including but not limited to keyboard, pad, stick, and a Guitar Hero controller, a game with enough depth for returning players and fighting game veterans, rollback netcode, a game with colorful and vibrant graphics, a free-to-play game, quote, the good kind, like Dota 2, end quote, with all characters being available from the start. The Steam page is filled with quite a bit of information regarding the game's selling points, colorful imagery, animated GIFs of the game, a few trailers. The out-of-place list of available characters is also present. In addition, a bunch more selling points that pretty much repeat themselves are listed. Those can quite easily be boiled down to: the game is easy to pick up and play, but hard to master, veterans of fighting games will like the game for its depth, all the playable characters are free from the start. It is worth noting that the game has been out on the Steam store since September 14th, 2017, and was not in fact a free-to-play game. You could buy the game for its initial $19.99 USD. In 2019, the game's price went up to $29.99 USD, and it's finally going free-to-play after July of 2020. Interestingly, some users that bought the game in its early access form for its initial price were also required to buy the game's core pack for accessing the previously available features. Additional content for Fantasy Strike includes original soundtrack, core pack, and a collector's pack. The core pack at $19.99 USD unlocks access to the staples of most currently available fighting games. Quote, arcade mode, versus mode for local play, including standard and team battles, survival modes, including 4 sub-modes, and the over-the-top boss rush mode, where you assemble a deck of power-ups against increasingly crazy CPU characters. The core pack also lets you send direct challenges to friends in both standard and team battle modes. The collector's pack at $99.99 USD includes the core pack, as well as 13,500 in-game currency for unlocking character skins, additional character costume, a unique KO effect, and 1 year of Fantasy Plus membership. Fantasy Plus is a subscription-based service inside of Fantasy Strike, which allows the player access to character-specific replays, look for replays of specific ranks, ability to slow down or speed up the replay, skip forward or back 10 seconds, or to the next round. Fantasy Plus membership also grants you a green name in-game and the exclusive skins, but only upon reaching a level 20 or higher with a specific character. Current status of the game is quite questionable at best. The store page features mixed reviews, with people complaining about the complete inability to challenge their friends for a match and the fact that it is, quote, locked behind a $20 paywall. Major negative reviews also say the following, quote, failed to connect. I bought the core pack just to play casuals with my friends. What do I get? Disconnects 90% of the time, waiting to connect and failing over and over. Some 10% we got a couple of matches going. End quote. Unfortunately, most of the positive reviews say what already has been said on the store page itself, praising the game for accessibility, ease of use, characters being free, and so on and so forth. Some actually praise Collector's Pack for having better value as opposed to straight up buying game currency from the store. Despite the game being cross-platform, which usually prolongs the longevity of a fighting game by quite a large margin, Fantasy Strike has rarely maintained triple-digit player numbers. As of recording, average daily peak in the last 30 days sits at concurrent 26 players, according to the Steam database. The few major spikes of player numbers happened on September 2017, release of the game with a 56 concurrent player peak, and July of 2020 with Fantasy Strike going free to play and accumulating a whopping 382 concurrent peak players. Fantasy Strike is described as a fighting game with the main goal of accessibility. Many traditional mechanics that were present decades ago in fighting games and that are present in currently popular games have been simplified to a heavy degree. This is where the purpose of the game gets very blurry. One of the highly voiced opinions as of making of this video is the notion that Guilty Gear Strive, because of its popularity, doesn't hold up and the simplification of the game was not needed and results in the loss of depth, despite in reality Guilty Gear Strive being still a pretty deep and incredibly designed complex game. However, another Guilty Gear game has quite an opposite problem, Guilty Gear Accent Core. Accent Core, or plus R for short, is regarded as one of the most complex games in Guilty Gear series. More unique characters with different quirks, character weights, guts, instant air dashes, dead angles, and so on. As much as it's an awesome game, it is quite a commitment to learn, which is why now it struggles a fate of being a niche fighter with a small but dedicated community, despite receiving balanced updates and patches. Plus R is by no means a dead game, just has a smaller following of dedicated individuals. Everything stated above raises quite a confusing question: should these games be simplified or made more complex? The answer in fact is neither. These games don't need to be on a spectrum. There is no need for an entryway. Fighting games can be played by anyone and should be played by people that have interest in them. If you like characters, lore, and mechanics, do play the game, do become a part of the niche community. No point to settle for less, always settle for more. Don't listen to a used car salesman claiming that you could get the best value for no effort. Where some people will choose the path of resilience with a choice of a traditional fighting game, some will flow like a water stream choosing a path of least resistance, but that path must still lead to the satisfying results. Fantasy Strike in a lot of moments is incredibly unsatisfying to play. In traditional fighting games, finally going from accidentality to intentionality, or in the other words, moving from just trying to do a motion input that you struggle with to intentionally doing it in a match as a reaction/countermeasure to your opponent's move, to finally chaining a move into a combo is one of the most satisfying moments in learning a fighting game. When all is given to you are strong moves and a quick press of a button, cross-ups, 50-50s and frame traps that set up on their own, the drive to play and win wears off really quickly. Thinking ahead and trying to distinguish what your opponent will do is simply not important or needed. Your strong one-button move will eventually hit the opponent and vice versa. If they get bored enough to start the attack, you're always guaranteed to punish in the laziest way possible. No excitement and thrill or anticipation of your turn to land that combo you've been spending hours on in training mode for. Menu has a striking, almost one-to-one resemblance to the Overwatch menu, which uncoincidentally makes it seem like the game was made for the fans of the hero shooter genre. Seeing a familiar UI might make it more comfortable for players transitioning to a completely new genre of games. It is also worth noting that the release and major spikes of popularity for Overwatch line up quite well in the development phase and release of Fantasy Strike. Though only a speculation, different parallels can be drawn between two games. In Overwatch, despite being a completely different game, there are around 3 to 4 abilities depending on a character with very distinct and understandable uses, which correlates with Fantasy Strike's one-button special design. Overwatch is also a pretty easy game to grasp for new players, since obscure engine-based tricks of sword games are pretty much completely ironed out. Graphically wise, Fantasy Strike looks on the bland side. Simple models, simple effects, pretty much all supers look very underwhelming, which results in little satisfaction in hitting them. It could be argued that simpler graphics means less screen cluttering and more distinguishable gameplay. That is true, however, it is an undeniable fact that Fantasy Strike has clearly received a substantial stylistic change and a graphical downgrade. From the release pictures featured on the Fantasy Strike's official website, it's clear to see that initially, game style resembles Super Street Fighter 4 with thick outlines and heavy shading. From looking at the blog post more, it seems like the developers and designers were facing substantial problems in the attempts to pull off Super Street Fighter 4's aesthetics. Jagged edges in certain lighting, broken shadows, and messed up physics. It is reasonable to assume that due to all of the aforementioned reasons, the graphics had to be toned down and smoothed in favor of more consistent yet less interesting visuals. For a game with such minimal graphics, it's quite heavy on player's GPU. With RAM to spare, Fantasy Strike requires 4 minimum and 8 recommended gigabytes of RAM, with the computer in question having a total of 16, the game has been tested on 2 graphics cards, NVIDIA GTX 1063GB and NVIDIA GTX 1078GB, and in both cases graphics cards were kind of struggling. As a comparison, the computer quite easily handles Guilty Gear Strive and Street Fighter V in 144Hz, and Streameter on NVIDIA GTX 1063GB with high settings at resolutions 1080p 30fps and NVIDIA GTX 1078GB with ultra settings at resolutions 1080p 60fps. Fantasy Strike, in its 6GB total size glory, is just a little less taxing than Battlefield 1. Sound design of Fantasy Strike is quite average. There are no memorable or catchy songs. Sound effects for hitting a command grab, guard breaking, etc. are not rich and sharp enough to inflict a Pavlovian response of instant satisfaction on a player. Fantasy Strike's health system. Your goal, as in any other fighting game, is to deplete your opponent's health bar to win. Health bar is portrayed as a big segmented line. Depending on a character, the amount of segments varies. Different attacks do different amounts of damage, usually as low as none to as high as 3. Also, due to the lack of any meaningful combos, damage scaling is completely absent. However, for a fighting game advertised as beginner-friendly and focused on fundamentals, there are a plethora of characters still capable of evaporating a player out of existence. A beginner new to a fighting game would probably enjoy the game by a large margin, with more room for experimentation and more time to figure out how to beat his opponent or why his current approach is failing miserably. It is understandable that certain character archetypes are supposed to be bulkier than others, but a beginner should choose a character they like and not someone they would have a better time with. Chip damage. The concept behind chip damage, or block damage, is pretty simple. An extremely small amount is dealt to the blocking player upon getting hit with a move. Certain games don't have chip damage whatsoever, others only have chip damage on special moves. Some games allow a win by chip damage, some don't. For example, Street Fighter V has their own system where chip damage exists for all the moves, but a player can only inflict an instance of chip damage once per normal move. Then it moves to a very tiny cooldown. Special moves ignore this rule. Also, a player is unable to score a KO with chip damage from a normal attack, but can do that with a super. In Fantasy Strike, you take damage from every type of attack, but light attacks. After successfully blocking 3 consecutive times, you take 1 damage. This is very counterintuitive to game's logic since blocking is usually a really good idea, and for a beginner being zoned out and quickly chipped to death with fire arrows or no effort invincible DPs would probably discourage them from a defensive playstyle which really hurts the player in the long run. While on the topic of blocking, the lack of crouching, at the basis of mix-ups, mechanic that makes lows, highs, mids, overhead swoops possible, the mechanic that a good defensive player will use every time while blocking an insanely long string to finally get his turn to shine on the opponent, a mechanic that is so crucial for ducking under certain projectiles, starting a combo with, and so on and so forth is straight up absent from the game that allegedly has its eyes set on neutral strategy and timings. It's hard to understand why a game designed by a former Street Fighter 2 player lacks such an essential element. The only logical reason behind absence of crouching is developers' attempt to prevent people from teabagging. 3 character pick. Fantasy Strike's mechanic of picking 3 characters is mainly justified by the opponent's inability to counterpick. Counterpick meaning to get in a matchup where a character does in some ways better than their opposing character, thus making a game a cakewalk for the former and a struggle for the latter. This mechanic has to be present since every character is quite easy to get a hang of, so the only way to artificially deepen the game is to force players out of their comfort zone while making them learn multiple characters. Some people like to play different characters and others might just pick an all-time main for a game and stick with it. Having an option is nice, and forcing somebody to branch out when they really don't want to seems like a bad idea. Yomi counter. Grabs are usually satisfying to tech, as annoying as they are, predicting them or reacting to your opponent's pattern of grabbing is very dopamine-inducing and rewarding. Like it or not, they are a crucial component of fighting games and are important to keep pressure up on your opponent, be it countered to someone that is a bit too block happy. Introducing Yomi counter, to reverse a throw you just need to do absolutely nothing. It is very interesting decision-wise and quite a positive learning experience too, although developers seem to take a bit too much credit for it. Usually normal throws are countered by pressing the same throw command back. This input obviously has to be well timed, just like in Fantasy Strike you have to do a Yomi counter at the right time. This means that the Yomi counter is not too different from a traditional tech throw. Now in regards to the Yomi counter, not blocking or doing anything in a fighting game is usually bad practice. A player should always take ground, look for openings, predict opponent's moves and respond accordingly. Doing nothing forces you to give up a lot of this. It takes an incredible amount of work, talent, and dedication to create a fighting game character, going through numerous concept iterations, endless trials and tests, making an engaging and memorable character as a behemoth of a task. Not to mention that a character in a fighting game also must obey the game's rules of balance, fit the style of the game. However, it's never one man's job. A lot of things in development, art, and sound design departments must go right to produce such a character. Now let's discuss the Fantasy Strike characters in general. Design-wise, visually, characters in Fantasy Strike leave much to be desired. Most animations for the characters are taken from other popular fighting games. It's usually fine to have a few moves as a reference to something that a developer or artist are passionate about. Take for instance Robo Fortune's Systemic Circuit Breaker. It even features an iconic Metal Gear Rising sound. However, in Fantasy Strike, almost the entire character's kit can be traced back to other pre-existing characters. This point could be argued by saying, quote, having a similar animation for a beginner player will result in a good learning experience for said player when they inevitably decide to move on to a traditional and more complex fighting game. The player will encounter a similar move and will already know its purpose. End quote. This makes total sense. However, most fighting games still manage to make similar moves look vastly different and way more visually pleasing, be it the moves serving a similar purpose. The easiest example of this is a pretty common Shoto archetype. More on why Fantasy Strike's understanding of a Shoto is flawed later. For instance, Ryu's famous Z-input Shuriken is a de facto special anti-air move. Ken, Akuma, Kage, and others, while belonging to the same archetype, have varying degrees of differentiation of the same moves. Ones are able to combo off of different special moves, juggle the opponent multiple times, and visually look different from one another. And we are only talking characters from the series that Serlin is most familiar with. in games like Guilty Gear Accent Core, Exard or Strive, and other games developed by ArcSys Works, the same Z input manifests in striking colors, beauty of animation with tremendous attention to detail, and of course audio cues with incredible sound design. Guilty Gear proves that making the same special move across the archetype is flashy, colorful, and satisfying to hit is quite possible when people that work on the game have a huge amount of experience behind their back and inextinguishable passion spanning many iterations of games and many titles. Complexity-wise, in comparison, once again, to Ryu from Street Fighter V, Ryu is usually viewed as an easy-to-pick-up, all-around character, with a skill complexity on the easier side, compared of course to some of the other Street Fighter V characters. This character is first of all a poster boy for most of the Street Fighter franchise. He is great for teaching fundamentals of the game to new players due to understandable all-around moves, each with a clear purpose. Ryu's special moves are also very satisfying to hit in pretty much any game. His BNB, bread and butter combo, in Street Fighter V is deceptively easy but very effective on how you can utilize it. Find ways to extend it and understand more about combos after getting more game experience. Ryu also serves as an entry to different, more complex and finicky characters. Just like riding a bicycle, knowledge of fundamentals never really goes away. Taking into account everything stated above, the entire roster of Phantasy Strike characters is much less complicated to just pick up and play while also playing them effectively. The following section is about individual characters of Phantasy Strike and the artistic liberties that have been taken by appropriating the majority of the moves from other fighting games. However, for the sake of integrity, a definition of a Shoto should be described first. Shotokan, or Shoto for short, is the colloquial term used to describe the fighting style used by characters such as Ryu, Ken Masters, Akuma, Gouken Sakura, Den, and Sean. Shoto characters generally serve as the base point for various fighting games, having a well-rounded moveset that teaches the fundamentals of the game to newcomers. Many later titles often diverge from the exact template for their protagonists, such as Kyoku Sanagi replacing his Yami Warai projectile for his iconic Origami Chain Punch, or Soul Bad Guy's moveset gradually diverging to include a plethora of other moves to focus on a hard-hitting grappler power and speed-based playstyle. Regarding the combination of a projectile, anti-air, and forward-moving attack remains the staples of many fighting game protagonists to this day. Internally, Shotos are referred as Konpachi characters, short for compatible. Grave. Grave by Serlin is described as a Shoto character. Grave is also categorized in game as a zoner character, which is simply not true. Shotos are supposed to be all-around good characters. Having a fireball does not necessarily mean that they fall under the zoner archetype. For instance, Guile, despite having a strong anti-air and a fireball, has to hold back due to the nature of the charge move. Grave's design seems very lackluster, just a generic samurai/ninja, which was clearly themed blue with lightning-themed powers and inspired by Ryu. Has an outright spammable DP that is just a standing slash move with quite a few invulnerability frames. This move is designed to be quite obviously punishable with quicker moves. However, people just tend to not do that, which results in Grave having a spammy playstyle. Insult to injury adds the game's health system, not giving a new player enough time to figure out that their initial approach to the spammy opponent is not working. A few examples of outright taken moves: Rashid's Spinning Mixer, Ryu's Shin Shuriken, Evil Ryu's Metsu Shuriken, and Yomi counter Akira's Palm of Death. Jaina. Jaina is another installment in a zoner category. Design-wise, is supposed to be related to Grave and be a counterpart to him. Very clearly designed after Ken, featuring his iconic flaming fireballs and flaming DPs. One of Jaina's trademark abilities is her DP that costs 1 health point to use. That seems like a severe drawback, however the move is incredibly effective, so much so that it appears that the 1 HP penalty was a hindsight to balance it. Other than that, she does play like a zoner, has a variety of fireball angles and even a charged fireball. Few examples of outright taken moves: Guile's back light kick, Hawkeye's arrow shot, Kei's DP, Ken's Shinryuken, and Akuma's dive kick. Argagarg, Garg. Argagarg. Garg, or Dalsim for short, is the third character in Zoner category. Any fighting game player will be familiar with his concept. Long-limbed, keep-away characters, and Arg is in no way different. His design is unapologetically close to Dalsim, with annoying poison and a wave that moves opponents away on top. Arg's poison move used to deal 2 damage, which was quite a big amount considering Phantasy Strike's health system, so it was toned down to just 1. Few examples of outright taken moves: Dalsim's Heavy Punch, Dalsim's Flying move, Fang Poison, Maze Whale. Geiger. Finally, the last Zoner is Geiger. Design-wise, he's just a man in a suit, made to look like a steampunk scientist. From resources and promotional material, it seems like Geiger is Serlin's favorite. This is a charged character, mechanics and intention-wise, almost a carbon copy of Guile. Weirdly enough, developers seem quite aware of this and almost proud of it. Usually Guile in Street Fighter games is a staple, as he is a de facto charge character. Once you explain the concept behind charge moves, it's pretty easy to grasp the general idea behind said character. Despite all of that, Geiger's mechanic makes it even easier. You have an on-screen charge meter that tells you exactly when to press an attack button. Usually one of the complicated parts about a charge character is getting the timing just right and nailing the input consistently. Geiger's mechanic completely nullifies that in an attempt to make the character easier to play. Few examples of outright taken moves: Heinz Stance, Bison's Back Throw from Street Fighter 4, Charlie's Moonsault, Rugel's Genocide Cutter, Guile's Forward Light Kick, Chip's Teleport. Now we can finally move on to a different Phantasy Strike category: Rushdown. Setsuki. Setsuki is your usual ninja student, combines fast moves, lots of damage, and low health. There are quite a few similar designs, but Setsuki just seems like a little adjusted version of Ibuki. Even the name sounds suspiciously close. There really is nothing that can be said about this character that wouldn't be apparent from the start. It's a fast, high damage glass cannon type. But due to the health system, spammability of moves, she's very effective in online play against people that don't understand the concept of taking your time and playing defensively, which is most people in gold ranks and below. Few examples of outright taken moves: Kage's Stance, Ibuki's V-Skill Glide, Ibuki's Throw/Neck Slash, Ibuki's Kunai, Ibuki's Dash, Kami's Hooligan Throw Follow-Up, Korean's Standing Medium Kick, Chip Super. Valerie. Valerie is the second Rushdown character in the game. Her design really closely resembles characters like Kareen from Street Fighter and Milia from Guilty Gear. Visual similarities would come quite close if it wasn't for the painter aspect of Valerie, which does give her a little bit of personality. She's officially described as a depressed artist, which seems really tacked on and does not make any sense from her visual or in-game quotes, which ends up being just quite manipulative. Valerie's kit includes a fast 3 damage cross-up and a moving hitbox to put an opponent into a disadvantageous position. With the entire plan of melting opponents before they realize what is going on, she does it extraordinarily well, making certain matches last for only few seconds. Few examples of outright taken moves: Love Heart's Stance, Love Heart's Sword. Even though concept of a forward striking move with a cross-up follow-up cannot be attributed to a certain singular character, similar moves have been done in other games. Characters like Kareen or Miss Fortune are capable of, for example, doing overheads, lows, cross-ups, stop the move and or do a special move instead. Valerie's move, for comparison, following Phantasy Strike's tradition, is very bare bones and offers players a minimum of options. Now, time for the infamous grappler archetype. Grapplers are commonly referred to as scrub killers, mainly for the large health pool, necessity as a grappler player to condition your opponent into making mistakes that would benefit you, and of course the command grabs. Rook. Rook is the first installment in Phantasy Strike's grappler category, and what a member of the cast he is. Design-wise, he's just a big dumb stone golem, as bland as his texture, because any respectable fighting game has to have a big guy that is slow in both movement and brain department. Every time before a match starts where Rook competes, you can hear his signature line, quote, "Don't let me get close," end quote. It is a warning to an unsuspected opponent of his well-thought-out playstyle, just in case the opponent misses an unfathomable amount of times people said, quote, "Grappler's job is to get in," end quote. According to the lore, Rook is supposed to be Fantasy Strike's tournament organizer, which I doubt he would be capable of doing. Featuring heavy use of Street Fighter V's grappler's moves, Rook serves as a great example why powerful grabs require a more complicated motion input and not just a button press. Few examples of outright taken moves: Zangief's SPD, Zangief's Lariat, Zangief's Body Splash, T-Hawk's SPD, Hugo's Cap, Aghanor's Command Normal Kick, Birdie's EX Chain Grab, and Potomkin's Heat Knuckle. Midori. Midori serves a role of a mentor character. Just like Gouken in Street Fighter, he's responsible for teaching the Fantasy Strike's poster boy and their counterparts. His design basically screams old martial arts mentor character for a special type of player. This is completely true regarding his gameplay as well. Midori could be described as a stance character. However, unlike characters like Zek or Lei Wulong, Midori's entire game plan revolves around getting into that stance. The idea of a slower character, gradually building meter, and after a while being able to transform into a faster, more powerful version of them is quite interesting. However, taking into the account Fantasy Strike's purpose as a game, existence of Midori doesn't make that much sense. He's a more complicated character, who could only be assumed was designed for players actively playing traditional fighters, or players with prior experience. Midori's kit is almost twice as big as any other character's, which lets him not only be more fit for all kinds of situations, but with a little more commitment straight up win more. Statistically wise, Midori is one of the characters with the highest win rate in the game. According to Serlin's own blog, he has a whopping 59% win rate. It's also worth noting that he's statistically one of the least played characters, which makes sense because for a new player, picking a character they like visually and would enjoy playing is a common practice and is much more important than picking someone who's good. At the end of Serlin's Game Balance and Fantasy Strike article reads a following paragraph, quote, "In the Fantasy Strike story, Midori is a martial arts teacher while Setsuki is a ninja student. It seems that in the games, masters play the master while students play the student." End quote. In reality, some characters are just more visually appealing to people and undergo a lot of attention from both player base and developers, resulting in a lot of complaints and following adjustments and balance changes. Other, least popular characters are rarely seen and played against, resulting in less complaints from a small group that actually plays those characters. In result, niche characters being changed less, and players being confused while facing this particular matchup. The following characters are categorized by Serlin as wildcard. These characters can, in fact, fit on already pre-existing archetypes, however for some reason developers decided that their playstyle differentiates way too much. Wildcard is usually reserved for characters with completely different idea behind them. Actual wildcard characters are characters like Mokujin from Tekken, 11 from Street Fighter V, and Double from Skullgirls. Characters in Fantasy Strike's wildcard category can quite easily be put in staple categories. The Grey. Starting off the dreaded wildcard bunch is the Grey. A man of class, dressed pompous, is incredibly old, wielding an immense power while also being immortal, is always accompanied by a female character. To some of you that might sound familiar, because it is. He is a very slightly altered copy of Slayer from Guilty Gear. Even upon defeat, they too lay in an identical pose. If you'll leave behind these striking similarities for a bit, the Grey is supposed to be a character based around frame traps, in other fighting games a challenging to set up yet rewarding mechanic. In Fantasy Strike, incredibly simplified, few to one button input. The Grey can quite easily be put into the rushdown category. Few examples of outright taken moves: Kim Ho's Kyaku, Slayer's Dandy Step Pile Bunker, Slayer's 2H. Lum. Lum is a gambling panda. He is definitely not a first appearance of a straight up animal in a fighting game, so critique of that would be quite nitpicky. However, it is worth discussing that an entire idea is once again taken from a Guilty Gear character, Faust. Faust's mechanic of tossing one item from a selected pool of items of different usefulness is one of his most unique and iconic aspects, never before featured in other fighting games up until the appearance of Lum. Taking such an iconic concept from a more popular fighting game series and a well-respected developer, and then slapping funny clumsy panda on it is akin to Limbo of the Lost straight up taking levels from Oblivion. Also, some of you might have formulated or came in here with a following opinion. Quote, the entire concept of Fantasy Strike is to take characters from popular fighting games and help new players adapt to different mechanics, end quote. That is understandable, however, this argument completely goes out of the window when you look at Lum. Knowledge of playing Lum will only ever become useful while playing specifically Faust in Guilty Gear series. As stated, there are no characters like Faust in Street Fighter, Tekken, and other games made not by ArcSys. And even then, Zappa and Platinum the Trinity feature a completely different playstyle from Faust, despite having mild random elements. Lum would quite easily fit into the zoner category. A few examples of outright taken moves: Faust's item toss, Faust super, and Faust trampoline. Quincy. Quincy's the next on the list. Design-wise, he looks just like an Alliance NPC from World of Warcraft. Mechanics-wise, Quincy's an after-image character with a weird Aegis reflector on top, or Gigantrikai for all the awesome Potemkin players. After-image is usually a rare type of character. Some characters feature mirror image-like moves but don't have a full playstyle dedicated to that concept, like Chip or Force Burn from Rivals of Feather. The reason behind that might be due to screen cluttering in a game genre where looking at the opponent's moves lands as one of the highest priorities. They would also be a nightmare to balance. It only remains a mystery why developers decided to lay their hands on such a difficult character type for a supposed beginner-friendly and fundamentals game, which seems to reign true for the entirety of the wildcard group. Quincy would quite easily fit into Rushdown category. A few similar moves include Chizuru from King of Fighters, Chip, and Badman. Onimaru. Onimaru is both the last wildcard and, as of writing, the last character in Fantasy Strike roster. Despite being another samurai-type character, Onimaru actually looks pretty cool. It definitely seems like he has been inspired by Samurai Showdown, which is a game that would benefit players to learn fundamentals quite a bit more, hence neutral game is way more important. Going back to General Onimaru, there's really nothing wrong with his design. He actually looks pretty awesome and brings something new to the table. However, that something is where the problem lies. His signature abilities enhance Scarbreak. Fantasy Strike's chip damage system, as mentioned previously, only allows you to take 3 hits before being guard broke and as a result getting damaged by 1. Onimaru's ability allows him to chip for 2 damage on an instance of a guard break. This is pretty powerful with Fantasy Strike's health system. It may be argued by the fact that Onimaru is slow and you need to work for your damage by getting in. By that logic, Onimaru can already be categorized in a grappler bunch. However, we unfortunately can't leave this on a high note. Everything positive mentioned above gets diluted by Onimaru's having attacks with intentionally lingering hitboxes, a multi-hitting invincible copy of Graves' DP, an anti-air super which summons a bunch of robots for screen control, and with that you got an incredibly strong character that is very annoying to play against. If you found any other taken moves that I've missed which were not listed in this section, you're always welcome to let me know. Anyone can play shooters, but fighting games are a commitment. Skills that we develop in our everyday use of personal computers are applied to shooter games, hence the popularity, incredibly low bar for entry, and thus huge accessibility and mainstream popularity. Skills that you need for a fighting game are completely different and are supposed to be acquired over time. It even depends on the type of controller that you use. This is why not everyone on the planet learned guitar in a few days. Trying to simplify means behind the mechanical mastery of a musical instrument will take away all of its soul and creativity behind the creator, thus resulting in artificially created media that we all see today. It's a bad idea to try and make fighting games as mainstream and as accessible as shooter games. It will not simply work because of quite a few reasons. People tend to blame others for their losses quite a bit. It's pretty much a coping mechanism at this point. In fighting games, games where the only one to blame for bad display is yourself. People tend to find excuses like, quote, the game is too hard, requires too much commitment, I don't have patience to study all of that, end quote, and so on. Certain individuals just love instant gratification upon doing something. Getting all the prizes, ribbons, bonuses, and XP is common practice. This is why when faced with fighters or RTS games, games that require a tremendous amount of commitment and player passion, people break and start begging for an easier alternative. Alternative that wouldn't be too easy to have 2 buttons, but easy enough to not learn a 50-hit combo. This is precisely a niche that Fantasy Strike attempts to fill, catering to a vocal minority of people with no intent to actually sit down and learn from countless online resources, better players, and most importantly, their own failures. Fighters will forever be a niche. It's good and there's no changing that. They are for strong people with the ability to improve and keep going. Learning motion inputs is rewarding. Throughout our lives, we accumulate a lot of muscle memory, be it drawing a specific line with a pencil, playing an instrument, or riding a bike. All of these things are a gradual progression of acquiring muscle memory, getting better at that task, being able to build upon the foundation of that muscle memory. Fighting games are exactly the same. Most of video games are. Let's take a Hadouken or the Fireball input as an example. It's one of the crucial parts of a Shoto kit because it allows you not to only zone but also condition your opponent into approaching. On paper, this move requires the player to press down, then right and a punch button in a quick succession. This input itself will be used many times, so it's really important to learn it and practice it. Eventually, it becomes second nature for the player and opens up many opportunities. All the cognitive power will be centered not on the input itself, but on the applications of it in-game. When it comes to a fighting game, learning motion inputs will help you in pretty much any fighter. In conclusion, a big thanks to you for taking the time to watch this video. I appreciate that immensely. Videos like this take a lot of time to make, including script, editing, and voiceover, and I would really value your feedback, a subscription, comment, or a like. Special thanks to Ray for helping with positive vibes and motivation. If you have a topic that I should make a video on, please let me know in the comment section below. Once again, a huge thanks for watching.